and thank you so much for joining today's event, Antimonopoly in a New Political Economy, co-hosted by the Economic Security Project and the Law and Political Economy Project. I'm Becky Chow. I'm the Director of Antimonopoly here at ESP. The Economic Security Project is an ideas advocacy organization that builds power for all Americans. We organize ideas, resources, and people to mainstream the idea that countering concentrated private power is critical to advancing a broader worldview of how and for whom the economy should work. In a little bit, you'll get a chance to hear more about the LPE project as well. And as part of our work, we're committed to convening spaces like these where folks from across academia, policy, and movement spaces can come together to learn and explore anti-monopoly issues so that we can sharpen our lens and build a shared understanding around how to tackle concentrated private power. We're in for quite a treat as we're joined by two pillars, if you will, of the anti-monopoly movement and a brilliant reporter, Edward, who will moderate the rich conversation. Both Tim and Sanjukta have done groundbreaking work defining the Anti-Monopoly Project and identifying gaps in the current antitrust framework that get in the way of more robust, vigorous enforcement. This conversation is happening at a critical moment too. We're on the precipice of a new economic paradigm that overturns the dominant neoliberal framework that idolizes free markets. In its stead is an acknowledgement and willingness to embrace public power's role in structuring markets that work for everyday people and the less powerful, instead of just concentrated private power. This moment is in large part thanks to the critiques that scholars like Tim and Sanjukta have been making for years, critiques that have led us to this opportunity to take a step back and interrogate the values that should guide our approach to structuring markets. Their work has been pivotal to building momentum for policy change that starts to redistribute power and rebalance our economy. We're beginning to translate and experiment with the rich, innovative ideas coming out of academic scholarship into policies and lessons to guide enforcement actions. There's plenty to celebrate. Congress is willing to embrace its role in exploring and seriously considering new legislation that rises up to the challenge of reining in monopoly power in today's economy. Just a couple of weeks ago, the House successfully voted to increase resources for the antitrust enforcement agencies through the merger filing fee bill. And there's the White House executive order that embraces a whole government approach to anti-monopoly and competition policy. And just today, our partners at IMAC are celebrating the incredible news that co-founder and co-executive director, Preeti Cristel, is a MacArthur genius in a well-deserved recognition of her leadership in the access to medicines and anti-monopoly movements. And you can read more about this historic moment and how the anti-monopoly movement, with support from ESP's Anti-Monopoly Fund, created the conditions for anti-monopoly action in our beautiful report, From Moment to Movement, the Anti-Monopoly Fund. We'll drop a link in the chat for you to check it out. Before I hand it over to Amy to say a few words about the LPE project and introduce our panel, a few housekeeping items. We'll have time for Q&A following the fireside chat. If you'd like to ask a question for our panelists, please use the Q&A function on Zoom, or if you'd like to tweet, please use the anti-monopoly hashtag, all one word, no hyphen. You can also follow us at Economic Sec Proj and LPE project _project, or LPE _ project. We'll also be recording today's event, which will be available on our websites afterwards. Amy, over to you.
Thanks so much, Becky. It's a treat to be hosting this with you and to have these three wonderful thinkers with us today. Just a brief word. So the Law and Political Economy Project is a very new initiative. It is operates as an attempt to create scholarly conversation and networks, particularly to revive thinking about questions of political economy in law and policy. And one of our areas of focus and some of the most vibrant work going on in the law and political economy, or LPE space, has been around questions of anti-monopoly. And is due to the work of people like those who are joining us today. So if you're interested in more about our project, which crisscrosses many other areas of law, I'll drop a link in the chat to both our project and the LPE blog, which hosts conversations about this and many other topics related to political economy. But rather than say much more about that, I'd like to then just turn to welcome our speakers and our moderator, and tell you just the briefest about their many accomplishments. So we have Tim Wu with us today, who is a member of the National Economic Council and a special assistant to the president for technology and competition policy. Tim is well known also as a professor at Columbia Law School, a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times, and for his formative work, intellectual work, including recent writing and book project on anti-monopoly thinking, but also on net neutrality theory. His books, The Master Switch, The Intention Merchants, Network Neutrality, and more recently on anti-monopoly, are quite well known and influential, and deservedly so. And in 2013, Tim was named one of America's 100 most influential lawyers, and more recently in 2017 was named to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Sanjukta Paul is professor of law at the University of Michigan. She studies, teaches, and writes in the area of antitrust, labor, and law and market governance more broadly. Her really formative academic papers on these topics have appeared in the University of Chicago Law Review, the Michigan Law Review, the Yale Law Journal, the UCLA Law Review, among others. And I will say that informally, people talk about her as our version of Ronald Coase, which, if you hang around in law schools, you know means quite a lot. She has a forthcoming book, Solidarity in the Shadow of Antitrust, Labor, and the Legal Idea of Competition, coming with Cambridge University Press. She's also been a practicing lawyer and has represented workers and civil rights plaintiffs and worked with labor unions on organizing and collective bargaining. And we have a superb moderator, Edward Ongweso Jr., who is a superb writer who writes about anti-monopoly, among other things, and technology, as well as crypto, labor, and many other things. He's a staff writer at Motherboard, and a really perfect person to start off this conversation. So I'll turn it over to you all now. And thanks so much for joining us.
Hey. Nice to see everybody here. I figured that for the first question, to set the stage, we can probably ask both of you, how you would describe or think about the current antitrust moment in terms of thought, but also policy that we're in right now. What, if anything, is unprecedented about the moment? What have you been thinking about? What developments are you keeping an eye out for or hopeful about, as the anti-monopoly movement, has been developing and gaining ground?
I guess I'll take that first, if that's all right. So from the perspective of the federal government and the administration, I think we are in one of these almost constitutional moments for antitrust. I don't want to go on at length of this, but if you are someone who's interested in the history of this area, there's almost these long 40-year cycles where the idea of what anti-monopoly means, antitrust means, seems to change. And, more generally, the sense of what the relationship between a democracy and its largest companies are can change, and what is right or wrong can change. And we're clearly in a moment where the very foundations are being rethought, where, as I think was said in the introduction, the sort of neoliberal assumptions of the last 40 years are being thrown into question. And that's kind of the intellectual side. At the government side, where I sit, we have a president, Joe Biden, who is firmly devoted to trying to turn this ship around, has in some sense, caught antitrust fever, and I think has done it in a way that I think is relevant to Professor Fall is going to say, through the sense that that above all, it is about workers and labor. Not maybe above all, but that workers and labor have been a neglected part of the story for too long. I think when the president talks about this, when he decides to put his backing, for example, in signing the executive order, it is by saying that there's been a systematic redistribution of wealth away from the middle, away from the working classes, towards a very narrow band of our society, and also a very narrow regional band. So I think that is the big change that's underfoot. Now, what does that mean in practical terms? Well, as people, as you know, people who may follow this area closely know, the president signed an executive order last year, which set policy, rededicated this country to something much closer to the original meaning of the antitrust laws, set enforcement policy for Justice Department and other branches of the federal government, asked the FTC to enforce the laws in a sense more motivated by their original intent, and set up for the first time a White House Competition Council, which is a lot of my daily work, that enlists all the federal agencies in trying to march down the anti-monopoly path. So that's a lot. There's a lot of specifics. There's law enforcement. We've appointed two very significant pro-enforcement, almost pro-original meaning of antitrust officials in Lena Khan and Jonathan Cantor. And I think we're, at the beginning, and I think this is a very challenging ship to turn around, and I think we will have setbacks as well as successes, but there's no question the kind of thinking and the kind of action that's ongoing right here is fundamental as opposed to incremental. Over to you, Professor Paul. I suspect you're on mute.
Thank you. Of course, we need to start off that way. So picking up on sort of, you asked about the policy moment, and I'm not going to speak about that too much right now, except to say that I think that there is a real link, as Tim has already said, about between sort of the potential potential policy and litigation action that we'll see, and I think the intellectual contestation that we're seeing, not just in the academy, but beyond, right? So I'm going to try to speak a little bit about that, but I think it's connected to, I think, the vision we see some of the officials in the Biden administration articulating. So just for example, I've noticed that in a number of Lena Khan's public statements, she has emphasized the idea of fair competition. And I think that this is really important to think about, why we would be talking about fair competition and not just competitive markets and more competition, although that, may also be an important policy goal. And I think if we, can take a step back and think about sort of, how we are conceptualizing what the goals of antitrust are, as Tim mentioned, what the statutory scheme is, and, actually paying attention to the statutory scheme, as opposed to relatively recent court cases that in many cases have overwritten that statutory scheme. We come to kind of a different vision of what we're doing. So if I may, we have a tendency in the antitrust world, I think, to sometimes talk about in terms of more competition or less competition, or even the competitive level of wages, prices, or some other market outcome. But I think one of the conversations we've been having in the last few years that I think fits nicely with the potential policy changes is that this way of looking at antitrust and what it's doing largely assumes away something else that antitrust law is doing, namely that it is always all, in addition to promoting or not promoting competition, it's fundamentally organizing forms of economic coordination. It's choosing among forms of economic coordination. It's sorting them. It's privileging some and disfavoring others. And there's nowhere that this is more obvious than with the business firm, where we largely sort of like write the business firm and the coordination that's contained within it outside. We write it out of the analytical picture altogether. And the consequence of writing it back in is not to say that business firms are bad and we shouldn't have them, of course, but I think it really changes the starting point of a lot of policy and legal debates. So I'll say another quick word about sort of the theoretical reorientation. I think the theoretical reorientation is quite simple to say. I'm not going to say the whole argument for it. That can be found in a number of papers. But the theoretical orientation I think that a number of us are urging is to start with the recognition that there is always economic coordination in markets. That is unavoidable. Whether it is happening in large business firms that essentially have, and we have sort of oligopolistic market management, which seems to be what's preferred overall by our current legal regime, right? So that is making a choice about economic coordination. It's not more competitive markets, or whether it's, whether it's horizontal coordination between firms, whether it is the government setting minima or, setting other terms on certain aspects of market outcomes. For example, a minimum wage is an aspect of that, but there's many, many other examples. So there can be public market coordination. These are all forms of market coordination. Vertical restraints placed by franchisors on franchisees, that's market coordination. So the question is not that coordination is bad and competition is good, although yes, real world economic rivalry properly channeled is absolutely important for innovation. We totally recognize that, but equally important is how we're sorting these forms of economic coordination, okay? So if we start from this analytic perspective where we just assume away the economic coordination that happens within firms, then we have this tendency for that firm-based coordination to enlarge at the edges. Let me give some concrete examples. So I think this is why we start sort of at like a plus position, if I may put it that way, for certain forms of coordination that antitrust law currently favors. So with merger policy, this is obvious, right? So if we have sort of, this basic idea that what happens within firms is efficient. By the way, when we say efficient, we mean lots of different things, right? So when I say we can assume that Amazon attained its current market position by attaining efficiencies of various kinds, that refers to productive efficiencies, technical efficiencies. The argument is that there is something, that's happening relating to the organization of economic activity that's ultimately being done by managers, by human beings in boardrooms. And right, I mean, it's not the magic of the market. It's actually human beings making these decisions. And we are effectively delegating that power to particular human beings currently mostly in dominant firms when we do antitrust law the way we do it now, right? So just to continue with my examples, I think that we see the effects of this sort of basic analytical picture in merger policy, because there's a basic assumption that what happens inside firms is ipso facto efficient. Otherwise, it would be done through contracting. So typically, there has been an assumption that there are often these efficiencies that offset the loss of competition. I mean, here I'm not saying anything controversial. This is, the question just becomes what the offset is. But we don't tend to do this similar calculation in a consistent way for other forms of coordination, which would include, for example, coordination among small firms, something that, by the way, the major anti-monopoly figures in history advocated, from sort of the farmer labor movement that originally advocated for the Sherman Act to Brandeis. Brandeis was a huge advocate of small business associationalism and also of labor unions. These are two things that he really stood for. He is generally credited by historians for pushing Wilson in a pro-labor direction, and not just in terms of minimum wages, but in terms of labor unions. He was one of the few middle-class reformers of that age who really was, believed in not just sort of the paternalistic, we need to get rid of child labor and have better working conditions in these factories, but actually we need to have workers have a voice in coordinating markets. I mean, this is not something I'm just sort of making up. This is deep in the anti-monopoly tradition, in the antitrust tradition, by its, the key figures that articulated it. So just very briefly to just go through my list. So this blind spot that I would contend is at the middle of our analytical picture for looking at and analyzing this area of law leads to then further policy blind spot. It leads to policy blind spots in the area of merger policy. In the way that I just described, we tend to see this enlargement of firm-based coordination, or what I would call the firm exemption. It occurs in the area of vertical restraints, where we say that, okay, well, we can assume, I'm obviously massively simplifying, that what these big firms do is efficient inside. Well, it's probably also efficient when they do it through contracts with their, not just subsidiaries, but with smaller counterparties. And so similarly, and this was a key part of the Chicago School Revolution. And then also, obviously, with monopolization, a doctrine that has been greatly contracted. And meanwhile, while these forms of coordination, which effectively expand the power of already powerful actors in the economy to essentially have an outsized role in market governance, even as those have been expanded, the role of smaller players has been contracted through the same paradigm. So that's really what we're trying to counter. And what I would say is that, we should talk about all the policy and how it fits in, but there are sort of analytical features of the picture that I think help to create this. And one final point is that we tend to flatten everything into, is it pro-competitive or is it anti-competitive? And I think that this erases and often does not clarify, because we can certainly. So, for example, there are multiple types. People will say this is efficient or pro-competitive, so we should allow this merger, for example. But we're really talking about fundamentally different things when we're comparing a loss in economic rivalry from a merger to putative productive efficiencies, right? So we can go into this more. Maybe this is getting a little too technical, but I think there are really analytical issues at the heart of how we talk about this stuff that we need to correct, even as we're pushing the policy initiative. So I'll stop there. That was probably too long.
Now it's Edward's turn to be on mute.
Now it's me. I was going to say, I think that was great, because then I do want to also ask you, Tim, on some of the intellectual, linkages when it comes to your thought, both in the academic work that you've been doing over the years, but also what you've been working on, in the White House, because I do think would like to, after that, talk with both of you about, maybe different ways of analyzing issues in the political economy that could be solved with antitrust that might have been solved or handled differently before it was taken up more as a lens for figuring out a reorder or restructure, way firms are interacting with each other, or politics, or conduct, in the private sector, basically.
I appreciate that question. Thank you very much. And before I was in government as a professor, I did spend a lot of time thinking about, as I alluded to, the history, the long cycles, the role that antitrust plays, almost a slightly unique role and a missing role in many countries in trying to, as I think I now see it, put a thumb on the scale as on the distribution of the returns of the economy through a different means than sort of taxation or government involvement in the economy. That seems a little complicated way of putting it, but it relates to what I feel is one of the main things I've noticed about the antitrust as almost a slight outsider. Now, I say that obviously I'm inside the White House and inside the government, but I'm not in the day-to-day of antitrust enforcement, but rather, sitting in a position where we're constantly thinking about the economy as a whole. And in terms of, Professor Paul had mentioned blind spots. This is what I think has been a major blind spot in the antitrust laws, and it is almost a macro or broader view of the consequences of all these sort of micro decisions and all these small analytical types of calculations on the big question of where the spoils of the economy are going. What is the distribution of wealth like? What kind of inequality or inequality do we have? And how does this contribute or not contribute to democratic governance? Those are huge picture questions. It's hard to imagine, the Justice Department sitting particularly on the latter ones. But on the former kind of macroeconomic questions, I think that it is an imperative. And I think one reason that we've got the White House, one reason I think the White House and the president have wanted to have us have a greater presidential role is an acute awareness that something like the concentration of key industries or lack of competition in a big industry like ocean shipping or rail or internet broadband or one of these sort of essential industries has enormous effects for the entire economy in a manner that is very difficult to see from a case by case. How does this merger look like? What are the efficiencies? Is it pro-competitive, anti-competitive? Because the aggregate, as we've seen, if you have sort of a green light, we lived through the green light era of mergers, really for about 40 years, but particularly over the last 15 or so. You start tightening up about some years ago. The effect of that was to lead to a transformation of the economy, one that was made decision by decision, without reference to the broader effects of them. And that's, I think, the role, and one of the things we think is an important presidential role, presidents elected, democratically elected, is to try to steer the ship and say, we can't let this be the province of, a few economic calculations based on HHI or whatever. This is our economic policy we're talking about. Now, I don't think that means presidents should be involved in individual cases, but I do think administrations needs to make clear that this, in some ways, is too important to be left to the microeconomists. I'll put it that way. I think it is in recognition of that we are trying to steer the ship again, that we are trying to transform this economy. President often says to one that works for all Americans, that isn't focused its attention on Park Avenue, but has a real effect of rebuilding the middle class and rebuilding the best of what America can be. Now, obviously, antitrust isn't the only tool, or anti-monopoly, but it can be a neglected one. And I think the project that Professor Paul is talking about, the key question of getting these analytical doctrines right and refocusing on what we think fair competition really means, is in some ways the instrument of the rebalancing that we're talking about. So that's somewhat of the connection. I guess my work academically pre-government had made me think that the big picture is important. Getting closer, I realized just how urgent the project is.
Maybe just to quickly add to that for a moment. So I feel like this is a perfect example of how actually the competition and coordination piece also connect, because I absolutely agree, right, that antitrust and in general, these like micro market governance tools, quote micro, but market, how law constructs market governance mechanisms should absolutely be part of the inflation conversation. And Ed, I think you've written about this too. And it's a confluence where at the same time, we're seeing all this criticism of our current way of dealing with inflation, which is through the Fed raising interest rates, right? Which is, explicitly contemplated. The causal mechanism is explicitly contemplated to run through either increasing unemployment or lowering wages, right? Neither of which is really consistent with this rebalancing project that we're talking about. And some of the examples you gave of shipping, ports, obviously, right? I think importantly, definitely an issue of antitrust policy, I think, both in terms of sort of the number of firms, but also in terms of these coordination rights, right? Because so if you look at the ports, I mean, actually, the labor organizing campaign I worked on right before started doing this stuff was port truck drivers. And these people are their work is critical in the supply chain, right? And we heard about this during some of these bottlenecks, and they are currently essentially denied any role in the governance of the port, the port ecosystem. And they have, aside from the fact that this has a, sort of distributional effects on income, I think it's important to recognize that a redistribution of governance rights, of coordination rights, can help all of us, because the workers who are, and other small business, others, people who are closest to the work that's actually being done in the economy actually have a lot to contribute to how to actually run these things truly efficiently, not just efficiently in this sort of, fantasy land of neoclassical macroeconomics, but actual productive efficiency, right? So to give a quick example, when these port truck drivers, essentially were disempowered post deregulation in the early 80s, not only did, so it goes from being a highly unionized industry to a non-unionized industry, and it becomes contingent work. So they're not classified as employees. And what you can solve this problem in various ways. I'm putting that aside for the moment. The point is they're now being paid by the load rather than by the hour. They also have no governance rights because they no longer have a union. But what does this mean? This means we start seeing these lines at the port because there's no immediate incentive to pay them for their waiting time. This contributed directly to the bottlenecks at the ports and therefore to all the backups that then contributed to inflation. Was it the only thing? No, but it was significant. I mean, we saw it was being written about in the mainstream press, and others, labor organizers have been talking about it for years and years and years. So this is a perfect example of where the seemingly micro absolutely affects the macro, and that antitrust and more broadly market governance, how the law is setting up market governance mechanisms, because again, that's a key lesson. There's always going to be market governance, whether Amazon's, unilaterally doing the market governance, or whether we are sharing that role in some way or another. And law and policy have a key role to play in setting that up. So clearly this is connected to the macro conversation. This is a very good point, I think.
Sorry, I'm muted again. This is perfect in that, we're running right up on time. So I'll ask the question that I wanted, based on the answers you both gave on, the influence of intellectual movements on policy. I'm always, one of my bugbears, in of itself, are on-demand, labor platforms more generally. And I think that the antitrust and anti-monopoly movement have raised like really interesting questions, or have an opportunity to raise questions about what sort of institutions do we want to permit or allow in the larger economy. There is a world where these on-demand labor platforms, but also similar, platforms can provide an efficient, optimized good or service, but have all these other odious outcomes down the line in terms of labor, in terms of effects on society or in politics itself. So when it comes to anti-monopoly as a tool, I mean, is there room for it to restructure or eliminate or zero out certain types of firms, activities completely? Or are we thinking of it more as something to kind of ensure that conduct is, fair and occurring in a way that doesn't feel too exploitative, and that, this is that fits into the larger economy and helps it hum along? I guess it's just like more so an extension of that question about like, what should the ends of this anti-monopoly be, right?
Do you want to start, Tim, or should I?
No, why don't you go ahead on that one?
Okay, so it's a great question, right? And the question makes me think of sometimes you see court opinions actually, in antitrust law, but also actually in employment law, that sort of beg exactly the question you're asking by saying, oh, well, we can't decide the case this way because then the franchising industry would go away, right? And this does not answer the analytic or normative questions. We shouldn't be, certainly shouldn't. It's not that the goal is to go after certain companies or certain industries, but to get to the right answer on how to manage the economy, and then I think let the chips fall where they may to some extent. So let me try to briefly say what I think would be the implications of that bigger picture stuff that I was in a pretty inchoate way trying to articulate before. So I see sort of three big implications that then would immediately have implications for these industries that you're raising. So one thing we haven't talked about too much yet is exactly how would we regulate vertical restraints, because the on-demand labor platforms and also the business format franchising industry, both places with serious labor problems in various ways, right, run on vertical restraints. They run by telling smaller counterparties that are putatively independent businesses what to do in terms of prices, in terms of what they can buy, in terms of what they can charge to their consumers, right? In terms of, what work they are going to take. There's some really good work coming out on this topic, empirical work by economists Marshall Steinbaum and Brian Kalachi and also others. I think there's a lot of work coming out on this that I think it's very important for us to pay attention to. There's cases under California antitrust law now, both against Uber and Amazon, I believe, challenging some of these vertical restraints. So I think that looking at vertical restraints as another market governance mechanism and whether they're achieving what they're supposed to do, some of this empirical work is showing a strong negative correlation. The Kalachi and Steinbaum and others paper, a strong negative correlation between these restrictive vertical restraints and worker wages. In the franchising case, franchisees' workers, and in the on-demand, there's not yet an empirical paper on that, so I'll withhold that. But that's in the franchising case. And this is really important to pay attention to. These distributional concerns that Tim is talking about, obviously, it also goes to the governance rights question in terms of whether, because very quickly, the other arm of what antitrust is doing is then denying coordination rights to those same smaller counterparties. And I just want to quickly say that I think that this is something that we should more aggressively do. And I would love to hear the president say this and to advocate it in some way. We are seeing a form of this in a different industry setting, the Journalism Competition Preservation Act, which is a bipartisan piece of legislation, has just come out of committee. This is a great example of reallocating coordination rights to the smaller platforms. It is an anti-monopoly measure. Again, there's historical basis for this. This is something Brandeis advocated. It goes back further to the Sherman Act era as well. And I'm really pleased to see this piece of legislation, but we could also do this, of course, for franchisees associations. In terms of I've kind of talked around the gig worker or on-demand labor platform issue a little bit, because they are so vertically controlled that, of course, there is a very strong argument that I'm pretty convinced of that they're actually employees, right? But I think our position on this is that we be going at it from both directions. These are impermissible vertical restraints if they're independent businesses. And if the vertical restraints are going to be allowed, then they're actually employees and they should be getting the full panoply of both the coordination rights, which is what labor law does, right? It grants coordination rights through unionization to workers. They should be getting that, and they should be getting the protection of the minimum wage, et cetera, right? So that is very briefly what I would say about the on-demand platforms, but it extends way beyond that. It extends to franchising. It extends to Amazon in terms of the small sellers who are subject to, the unilateral provisions set by Amazon, et cetera, across the economy, I think.
When Woodrow Wilson was running for president in 1912, he ran on a platform of regulated competition, if I'm not mistaken, and it and in some ways, I think that's what we are speaking about here. But I want to go back to your original question and think about it in a slightly different way, and introduce a little bit about how we've been thinking about it across the administration. So your question was, is the Antimonopoly project just or antitrust? I'm not sure what you said. Let's say the Antimonopoly project or antitrust. Is it just rules of the game, which I think are actually, are very important for a fair competitive landscape? Or is it also sometimes willing to say, without stating any industry in particular, this set of way of doing business is forbidden, or this should not exist, or so forth. This, we have just looked at this enough, and we know what's going on here, and we think it's not compatible with the kind of economy we believe in, or the people. It's the will of the people that this particular conduct be banned. Sitting where we sit, which is with access not just to the antitrust laws, but also all of the laws and all of the agencies that enforce the laws, I think there is room and scope, and in fact, a real importance in, I don't know if the right word be returning, but having a mixture of situations that are governed by what I guess I would call a more classic rules of the game, and areas where you would like to have stronger per se rules once you feel that with an understanding or basically a direction, often from Congress that this should not happen. This should happen. And we're sort of used to it. We used to call these the regulated industries, and I think one of the things I've noticed in this job is the importance of those two projects working together. I'm speaking slightly more abstractly, but let me try and maybe I'll even make it more abstract. I think over the last roughly 40 years, we've been in a situation where there's been, it's particularly in the antitrust, an idea that every single thing should be judged by a cost-benefit analysis, a rule of reason, and we will, sum up the pluses and the negatives of every kind of thing that's out there and try to make a decision about it on a case-by-case basis. Well, there's a few that is, I think, normally very appealing, particularly in a world where everything is known and you can sort of judge every case exactly on its merits. But in the real world, the need to challenge things on a case-by-case basis, as if everyone is new, when you know that you have conduct that is costing people billions of dollars unfairly, really amounts to a burden on the government or on private plaintiffs that is something of a green light for the conduct. A good example is you take pay for delay, which is a scheme whereby a patent holder essentially pays off a generic drug maker to stay out of the market for a certain number of years. They divide the monopoly profit between themselves. I think the FTC had noticed by 2002 that this was just a way of making people pay more for medicine and a splitting of a profit. And, they eventually litigated to get a good rule. It took approximately 12 or 14 years. I think we believe that it's important to move more towards a system, and the executive order on competition says this, where there are competition rulemakings. Federal Trade Commission was asked by us to take on a number of projects like that, where we think they can come up with a rule. We've also asked our other agencies. The FCC has been doing this for some time. We've asked our other agencies to try to find conduct or situations where they think there's an inherent anti-competitive nature to it, or an inherent a problematic nature to it, and to write rules. So part of this is, I think, and I'm not suggesting that'll be every case, but we, I think, are moving away from the idea that we're going to judge every single case on the merits, have a full trial with expert witnesses on each side to decide, and declare certain practices and conduct off limits. Congress, I think, has gotten more involved in this as well. They're a little bit episodic, but they play an important role. And obviously, anything that comes from Congress represents a greater level of, or the imprimatur of representing the entire elected sides of the government. So anyway, that's a little bit rambling, but it is, I think, an important part of the project we're trying to do here in the White House and the Biden administration to have a movement towards calling out certain things that in a per se or a inherent way should be considered vital to the laws. Thanks.
Ed, can I add one quick thing on the question of translating the analysis to policy? So I think one other thing that's been definitely intertwined in the discussion, but maybe not as forwarded, is the question of merger policy. And just briefly, I think another implication of sort of taking this, this slightly different analytic and normative lens on market governance to that, it's no longer just a question of offsetting competition and efficiencies, right? But I think it's also a question of, overall, what does a lax merger policy do? It fuels a type of activity and actually a type of competition that may not be pro-social and, and pro-efficient. In what sense do I mean that? So there is work out there by more by finance folks, I would say, and I would credit I credit Josh Mason, but there's many others who have written about this as well. That overall M&A activity funnels incomes from the funnels funds from the productive sector, like real business investment, employment, etc., to the financial sector, basically corporate lawyers and bankers. And so it's a form of extraction effectively, right? Like it's not always like there are, but the overall at a social scale, that's what lax merger policy is doing. It's funneling funds more than funneling investment into production. It's funneling funds generated by production out of the productive sector. So that's away from R&D, away from increasing jobs, et cetera, right? And we again see that on a micro scale. We just talk about it in individual mergers in terms of are there redundancies, right? But I think that this misses what's happening on a social scale. I think this is again a connection between the micro market governance questions and the larger macro questions. And one other quick point about that, it's also channeling business competition. And I think that this is something that that I should be calling you Professor Wu, I guess, that Professor Wu has been talking about in terms of the fair competition rules. And, we're interestingly, I think, going to be seeing the FTC using its competition rulemaking authority, which I'm, very interested in seeing. And that's creating rules of the road. That's channeling business competition in certain directions. So is merger policy, right? Because if you have a lax merger policy, you are actually, channeling, it may become the case that for a particular business actor in a particular market, that they're actually forced to engage in either acquisitions or putting themselves up for acquisition, as we well know from particular cases. But I think that this is something that the policy overall encourages. Whereas if we channel competition away from that, then they need to compete on, actual R&D, innovating, creating new products, again, doing actual production. And so again, I think I want to be very clear. We're not against efficiency. I don't think it's fairness versus efficiency. We shouldn't assume that this is a zero-sum trade-off at all. I think that we can be fair and we can be efficient, but I think we are suggesting a way of looking at efficiency that is more real world, that's about actually where our productive resources being channeled, and that is less about, I think, some of these textbook models.
Thank you. I think we can go into questions. We have a lot of questions. We're not going to be able to get to all of them, so I may jump around. The first one I want to ask comes to us. It's asking about the mentions of Chairwoman Khan invoking fairness increasingly, and the overlap there with Commissioner Vestager in the EU and its anti-monopoly policy. So the question is, do they seem to have similar interpretations of the term? And is there a bigger space for cooperation between the EU and the US antitrust law and policy today than there might have been pre-big tech?
I'll say a few things about that. First of all, Chair Khan has been talking about that, and we welcome that form of analysis. I think at Fordham we were both at Fordham at a recent conference, and one of the things that she said there, which I think is worth emphasizing, is that the project that we are undertaking here in this administration is not some rejection of rule of law, but rather a return to following congressional intent, which is frankly what we are supposed to do as tasked by the Constitution. If you take even the most casual look at what Congress intended the antitrust laws to be and to do, and who they were supposed to serve, and what kind of goals they had in mind, you will not find the word efficiency anywhere in the statute. Now, that isn't that doesn't mean that that efficiency doesn't matter. Doesn't mean it shouldn't be a consideration, but the idea should be the guiding light of all that is done when it's not actually what Congress asked us to do is significant. And so I think part of the restoration project is a return, in a sense, to rule of law. Rule of law meaning doing what Congress says, as opposed to what you've glossed onto it in 40 years of your own interpretations of it. And I'm tired of talking about the government approach. We encourage the courts, to also respect the fact that these statutes had their intent and had their goals, which have, I would say, been and have, there's been broad deviations from it. So I think that's very important. On the question of Europe, I sit on the Trade and Technology Council, which is it's probably not exactly a household name, but is a European U.S. Intergovernmental entity, basically designed to facilitate cooperation and have us be great friends. And I would say that one of the landmark changes of this administration and the last administration is our close and friendly relations with Europe. It doesn't mean that we agree with them on everything, but I would say the alignment as between where Europe is on a range of issues. Now, it starts with things like the war in Ukraine, where there's been an extraordinary level of solidarity between all of our governments and the Ukrainian government, and related issues, economic. We are very aligned. Whether that comes to we have the exact same reading of statutes might be a little different, but I would say that U.S.-European relations that are all-time, maybe post-World War II is the all-time, but they're at a very high benchmark, and I think that's been extraordinary. I mean, it's easy to remember. It's hard to believe that 4 or 5 years ago we were almost in economic warfare with Europe. Not actual, but the relationships were extremely strained, and I think that we're it's almost the best place we've been in a very long time.
I think then next question is asking, could you speak on the extent that barriers on horizontal coordination and disputes, arbitration mandates, disabling class collective actions, bans on independent contractor unions, et cetera, plays into this landscape of the allocation of economic coordination rights? And secondly, is it a symptom of or cause of concentration?
Maybe I'll speak to that really briefly. So I think this is absolutely a piece of the project, right? And a central piece of the project. I mean, I sort of see, there being maybe 3 or 4 key elements here: a much stricter merger policy, clear fair competition rules, whether those are through rulemaking and through a revitalized monopolization doctrine, right? Since that's been greatly contracted. And then this is sort of related, but a much stricter attitude toward vertical restraints, and then liberalizing the attitude toward horizontal coordination. This is, 4 things that I think, across the economy could be really transformative in redistributing incomes, but also coordination rights, right? And governance mechanisms and connecting up with all of these bigger whole economy questions that we've been talking about. So horizontal coordination rights are absolutely a piece of this. And I don't think I think it's whether it's a cause or a consequence. I mean, I think there's a symbiosis and the way that I would explain it, connecting it back to the analytical points, is that we can't just have this attitude that we're going to stamp out every form of, which we're not doing anyway. We're privileging coordination through big dominant firms, right? But we're trying to stamp out every other form of coordination. I mean, that's a way of very simplistically describing sort of what our attitude toward economic coordination is now. So if we change that, I don't believe that we can just change, become more strict toward sort of the big business form of coordination, which I think is absolutely a piece of what we need to do. But I think we have to counterbalance that. People frequently talk about countervailing power. Fine, that's a piece of it, but we have to go past countervailing power, because the horizontal coordination rights aren't just, it's easiest to see maybe when there's a big platform on the other side, whether it's Amazon, whether it's Facebook and Google extracting all the advertising revenue and, causing journalism to go into free fall. But I think a fundamental insight of looking at how markets actually work is that markets abhor a coordination vacuum. Some form of coordination is going to come up to fill the vacuum, because that is actually how markets in real life work, right? And I think that there's all, in a way, the most charitable reading of, I think, the Chicago School Revolution is that it's recognizing that in one direction, and it's just legitimizing sort of oligopolistic and monopolistic market coordination. So, and again, I think history's on our side here. Brandeis called it regulated competition, and that whether we call it that or fair competition, creating and supporting some other coordination mechanisms is key to maintaining, a sort of participatory market governance structure. So that means, yes, I mean, my opinion is that we need to not only permit, but encourage a lot more forms of coordination between small players. I will just mention, we were talking about other countries. Australia, the ACCC, the competition agency in Australia, actually a couple of years ago promulgated a rule permitting horizontal coordination among small and medium-sized businesses. And this is the law of the land there now, right? I mean, this is not an insignificant economy. And I will note that labor scholars in Australia were out in front of advocating for that rule. And I don't, to bring this back to the gig economy, again, it's a little complicated because with the extent of control in the gig economy, I think that under American labor and employment law, for the most part, these workers are actually employees, right? But that doesn't mean that true independent contractors should not have horizontal coordination rights. They absolutely should. They might not be quite what labor law looks like, right? But again, this is what Brandeis actually contemplated, small business associationalism. And this is very much what the farmer labor movement that pushed for the Sherman Act advocated. They were, explicitly, there's writings that say that, we're encouraging cooperation among our ranks, and we're also encouraging the federal government to come down on monopoly. These two things went together. And I think that, this is maybe where we have the most growth to do in our policy thinking, I think, because I think that we need to catch up a little bit in this country with some of the thinking, I think, especially in Australia. I don't think the EU is there either, actually, on this. But yeah, so I heartily endorse that.
And I think maybe we probably have time for a few more questions. This is a two-parter, I think, one for each of you. The first question is, with us being in a moment of questioning neoliberal assumptions and with Biden seeking to bring what should replace the consumer welfare standard? And then for Professor Paul, what does reorienting the antitrust foundations imply for setting a new antitrust standard?
I think I'll defer that first question to Professor Paul.
I feel like we've sort of answered, around this, but I'll try to reframe. So I kind of feel like the debate over the consumer welfare standard is a little bit of a distraction. I'm not sure I want to have the debate on those terms. I sort of, again, like the 4-point program that I sort of see, which is still sort of high level, is, liberalize horizontal coordination way more. We do need to do, again, I said that is a growth point. We need to, because I don't think that we just sort of liberalize all horizontal coordination. There has to be some public oversight, right? But this goes with the analytical frame, which is that there is no such thing as just this competitive market in the abstract there is always a social role. So we need to actually embrace that, lean into it, figure out, it's going to take some work. This is what the FTC was always supposed to do. We need to fund the FTC to do market studies that are actually empirically grounded in the dynamics in these, to see, what would work in these different scenarios. I also want to briefly here mention, there's so much good work, I think, emerging all the time. There's really good historical work. I've already been talking about Brandeis, but there's really good historical work, I think, about how the labor and anti-monopoly movements intersected, not only pre-Sherman Act, but also actually in the progressive era. And Brandon Adams, who has an LPE blog post, which maybe we can put in the chat or something on this, has done work on the coal mining industry, which actually is closely connected to the debates over the labor exemption in the Clayton Act. The bituminous coal was a key piece of those debates. But anyway, his work is about how small coal operators and the United Mine Workers actually united against the railroads, or tried to. They weren't successful in the end. And this is, I'm just mentioning more historical precedents of roads not taken, right? So this is, I think, would be another way of doing this. I got a little bit off the original question, which was the consumer welfare standard. I do agree that yes, to the extent that we're like evaluating specific rules or specific cases, we obviously, cannot just look at sort of, is this going to lower prices, which incidentally isn't what the neoclassical, this is an internalist problem actually, because that's also not actually what like a truly consistent neoclassical microeconomic analysis would entail. It would say that their prices should be at the competitive level. That may be below or above the current status quo level. So in any case, the consumer welfare standard should just be wrong as a textbook matter. But I think we need to kind of go beyond that and think about articulating these specific rules. So liberalize horizontal coordination, come down hard on vertical restraints and mergers, and articulate fair competition rules. And obviously there's a lot more work to do there on the details.
I think, maybe one last question. Here. How do you reconcile federal preference for enforcement of arbitration provisions under the FFA with the antitrust labor concerns that those types of provisions create?
That is another good question for my colleague in this session, Sanjukta. Sorry to put you. Can I make a comment though on what you said? I on the broader thing, and I think connects to the question about integration of post-Chicago school, which is sitting in the Q&A. I agree with the idea that it is important almost not to fetishize this question of whether you are pro or against consumer welfare. I mean, who's actually against consumer welfare? It's obviously important, and in fact, just make clear that many of there's a large core of activity that the Biden administration is focused on, that is dedicated to lowering prices for average Americans. And it's not like we have some desire not to do that, and I think that's frankly key to the agenda. And some of the worst offenses still remain good old-fashioned price fixing and mergers to monopoly and other forms of inflating prices that frankly hurt people, hurt everyone, and those are obviously an area of concern. I think we should no one's against consumer welfare. I just want to make that clear. What we should accept as allies is everyone who's dedicated to this project of sort of rebooting the antitrust and anti-monopoly movement. And I think, and if you read our executive order on competition, we firmly believe that there are more constituencies than consumers. Consumers matter, but that workers matter, farmers matter, small producers matter. that we want, a broader redistribution of the economic spoils, and that's expressed in a broad number of ways. There's a macroeconomic issue of how our economy is structured. And, I think that consumers are a huge part of that. And I just want to make sure we're not being misunderstood here in what ends we're trying to serve. Sorry, there was a question on arbitration, which I think I'll defer to Sanjukta, Professor Paul.
Could you repeat the question, or sorry, I didn't.
No worries. How do you reconcile federal preference for enforcement of arbitration provisions under the FAA with the antitrust/labor concerns that those types of provisions create?
I don't think I understand that question. I mean, yeah, the FAA has been misinterpreted by the courts to send lawsuits between, I just may be missing something about what the antitrust labor concerns those raise, but the FAA on its own terms has been misinterpreted, in my opinion. It clearly excludes workers, and it's been misinterpreted to send cases that should be in court into commercial arbitration, when it's fairly clear that the legislative history of the FAA says that workers were meant to be exempted, and so this is not really the topic here, but I'm not totally getting the connection to this. It's connected in the bigger sense, for sure, that the sort of what the judiciary in the last 30 to 40 years has done to kind of narrow redress and to the extent that I absolutely agree, class actions are a form of coordinating through the judicial system. So certainly would affirm that.
Yeah, I think that's it in terms of time for questions. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all of them, but thank you both for, talking with me, and also with, giving us a peek into the things that you're thinking about for antitrust and anti-monopoly movement as well.
Thank you very much.
And then.
Yeah, and so to quickly close us out, thanks so much for joining us today. Thank you to our esteemed panel, Tim, Sanjukta, Edward, for all those gems of wisdom and the provocative questions, the Law and Political Economy Project, especially Corinne, Amy, Raul, and the folks behind the scenes at ESP, Michael, Kara, Christian, TJ, and Chris for helping us put together this fantastic event. Follow us on Twitter at economicsecproj and LPE_project to stay tuned for updates. And I would just say that LPE project has some seriously great events coming up next week, so I encourage you to check those out as well. And we'll have the recording from today's event up on our website shortly. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.